Hello, everyone. This is my second session today, and what I do before I start is negotiate with the producer a bonus if I actually don't use all my time, and I just got it, so hopefully I'll be the only one in this room that cuts down the time. The second thing we're going to try to do, which is probably going to be a first, especially for this session that was, I think, in this area about energy and climate, you must have observed the overuse of acronyms when it comes to climate, which, we all know that since the beginning of time has made simpler things complex and turned complex things into an alphabet soup. So I'm going to come hard on each and every one of you when we talk about VCMs, voluntary carbon markets. But look, climate is a complex issue, as we all know, and voluntary carbon market is something that sounds as magical as acronyms. So in the next 25 minutes, so I can get my bonus, we're going to try to answer some basic questions. Now, because the topic itself is complex, and I'm pretty sure that none of you can explain to your grandparents what you do as it relates to climate or voluntary carbon markets, I'm going to ask each one of you for 2 or 3 minutes to just give us a little bit of context on why did I invite you to be in this panel, and then we'll take it after that. I think you will relinquish enough information that's hopefully will make sense. So I'm going to start with you, Tony, and you can find their bios. I just want them to explain what they do and why is it relevant.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much, and thank you to the Delphi Economic Forum for having us all here. So at Hemlock Ventures, what we do is we speak and advise to people in the ESG voluntary space, voluntary carbon space.
Speak louder.
Yeah,
louder.
Voluntary carbon space and for impact investing. So that's what we basically do. So what do we mean by a voluntary carbon credit or a voluntary carbon market for that matter? So a voluntary carbon credit is basically a measure of taking 1 ton of carbon out of the air and putting it somewhere. That can be a direct carbon capture, it could be a tree, it could be a series of projects, it could be waste to energy. And so what's happening is you basically take this carbon out of the air and you put it somewhere. And once you do that, the project that does that gets a voluntary carbon credit. In order for that to happen, somebody comes up with methodologies, you adopt these methodologies, you then go to this verifying company, whether it's Gold Standard or Vera or somebody of that sort, and you say, I want to you to look and see that I did it correctly, yes, and then this carbon credit is issued by these NGOs, these non-for-profit organizations. ACX, who we advise to and work very closely together, and its acronyms are Air Carbon Exchange. And they are an exchange that trades these voluntary carbon credits. What happened before that was that most of that trading happened in the over-the-counter market. So you would go, you would try to look for it, and it was a very opaque market and a market that really didn't have very good pricing transparency. So what happened as a result of that is the fees that were charged for these transactions were exorbitant. And so ACX decided, Air Carbon Exchange decided to create an exchange, to create that exchange in a blockchain environment, and then to go to a regulator and try to get regulated. They actually went to Singapore. Singapore told them no, and because they said that carbon is globally not regulated, and then they decided to go to Abu Dhabi, which said yes. So they are the first regulated carbon credit exchange, and what they do is they do JVs with different exchanges in countries around the world to grow these markets.
All right, fair enough. Nico,
yeah.
What do you do?
So I'm here representing Kaya Partners. We're a climate policy firm. We advise corporates, many of them in Europe and the US. We advise investors and advocacy and other organizations like industry federations. The advice that we give is, as I said, on climate policy. We aim to help them understand what climate policies mean for their business model and to prepare for the future and to take advantage of the opportunities that may be there, or at least be able to map out how policy will continue to affect them going forward. In a nutshell, that's what we do. We've done quite a bit of work in voluntary carbon markets for clients. For one of them, they wanted to create a framework around purchasing offsets. With another client, we did a market structure survey and analysis. And with others, it really is about how voluntary carbon markets, together with their compliance market obligations, fit in as part of their net zero pathway.
Can you very briefly explain the difference between compliance and voluntary carbon markets, just for the sake of the audience?
So compliance markets are really nationally, or in the case of the EU, regulated at the EU level. These are markets where a company, a heavy emitter, is asked to pay an allowance for each ton of emissions that they emit. The regulator makes sure that this price, through an auction system, matches a certain supply and demand. And in most of these compliance or cap and trade systems, there is a pathway where you're looking to emit less allowances over time and therefore force the heavy emitters to transition to less heavy emitting processes.
Yeah, and I think, if I may add, the main difference, or one of the ways to think about it, is that the compliance markets are volume driven, right? You start from volume, and you say this is the volume for this year.
Yes.
And voluntary carbon markets start from the price.
Yes.
So that's an interesting also qualification here. Nico, what do you do? I think I know you.
Yes, well, I come from the exchange world, so I'm Chief Operating Officer in the Athens Exchange. We've been involved in the early auctions that were run for Greece for the compliance market since it's been defined. And we are very interested in seeing how the voluntary carbon markets could evolve and what would be the significance of such a market in Greece and how we could assist the Greek voluntary carbon credits when they come out to create liquidity and organize them in a way that would be functional for participants, for buyers, for sellers, for offsetting, and basically to bring the 2050 goal of net zero earlier.
Good. So look, because obviously Nikos works at the exchange, I'm going to heavily bias my questions towards the first two speakers, and I'm just going to almost ignore my COO. But feel free, Nikos, to jump in and correct them if you can, right? Or just add. I'm just kidding. You cannot correct them. So let me start with Tony on one basic question here. Can you tell us a little bit about what is the state of the voluntary carbon credit markets right now? And what do you think are the trends that are emerging in Europe in particular? Because Europe is not really associated with voluntary carbon markets so far.
So far, yes. So let me start with the question that I'm always asked when this topic comes up. It's like, well, isn't it greenwashing? Maybe. Isn't there some stuff that's happening that's not correct? Maybe. But what's the alternative? The alternative is to do nothing. So that's not going to work. So we have this framework of these voluntary carbon credits in the world, and what we have to do is we have to really see how we can lift these problems that exist and make a floor in what's acceptable to be either traded, delivered, or offset. I think that there's a lot of people coming together and trying to accomplish this, whether it's, and we're going to get into acronyms, but there's some regulatory bodies that are working right now. They've come out with some initiatives, and so now there's starting to be clarity on what can be delivered and what can't be delivered.
But to be clear, this is a ultimately non-regulated matter, largely speaking.
The whole industry is non-regulated. I think that what's happening is there's this idea to get it more regulated. So for instance, the CFTC in the United States is looking at the voluntary carbon market and trying to come up with a policy. As I said, Abu Dhabi has decided to go ahead and regulate voluntary carbon markets. So what's happening is I think that you're going to get a situation where, I come from a trading background, an oil trading background, and so, it was the Wild West in the early days.
So you're trying to repent now.
I am repenting. I'm not trying to repent. I'm repenting.
Okay.
But, we put minimum standards, sulfur standards, deliverable standards, where you can deliver. And all of a sudden, the price discrepancies started to grow, and you had this core of good delivery that can be made. I think the same is happening right now as we speak in the voluntary carbon market. And especially with the removals, that's something that you can actually measure. So those are trading at a way bigger premium than, let's say, an older project that came out of, not to pick on anything but China, where that's a 50-cent project and a removal can be a 200 or 1,000.
So price is a discovering mechanism for
price
this?
Is a discovery mechanism, and you are having some green tech that's getting involved, whether it's satellites looking at forests and sort of, are people doing what they say, whether it's putting a meter on a carbon capture facility and seeing what you're capturing. So there's this idea of sort of where technology and verifiability meet and happen. Now, going to Europe for a second, yes, Europe has sort of taken the stance of the big polluters, it's compliance, EUA, you pay. Having said that, a company like Volkswagen is probably retired the most amount of credits last year. They did that because they have plants in Brazil, they have plants in the United States, and they aren't buying EUAs for those. They're going to the voluntary market, and they are buying voluntary carbon credits and retiring them. Shell is doing the same thing. So two of the biggest, and I'm bringing them up because they are the biggest companies that are retiring right now, and so they're using the voluntary market. I think you're going to see more and more of that because you cannot get to net zero without a voluntary market. I don't think it can happen.
All right, let me put a
pin.
Yes.
a pin and a soft period on this. But Nikos, so ultimately, okay, I'm going to deconstruct you. You're a consultant. So what are you consulting people when it comes to voluntary carbon credits or voluntary carbon markets? What's the priors that you guys have arrived from your own research?
Absolutely. So I think, as Tony described, in the voluntary carbon markets, we have a segment that has grown enormously over the last decade, with fits and starts and with increasing attention at its growth. I would say that the genesis of this market is on corporate social responsibility. Really, a lot of the sponsorship in the early days, and even today, comes from efforts to align, like what you described in Brazil with Volkswagen, to align your local footprint. And this, of course, we all think about carbon, but a lot of these projects, because they have co-benefits, they benefit local communities, they increase perhaps environmental attributes. They are aligned with that vision and with that ambition of many corporates to be good corporate citizens of the communities where they produce and where their goods are consumed. We tell our customers that, that the voluntary carbon markets, as much as they have been under fire, because of methodology issues, because of measurement, because of the lack of regulation, and they're under fire for integrity, they're still a very useful tool to deal with climate change. And it is a tool that increasingly policymakers are turning to and will bring in within the regulatory fold.
I'll ask for a couple of examples on that, so to see how the evolution is happening here, especially in Europe. But just before we go to that, I'll give a chance to Nikos to one more question, Nikos, for you, which is a basic question. I mean, why would or should we have an exchange either in Greece or in Europe that deals with voluntary carbon credits to begin with? And why ATHEX? Why would ATHEX think about that?
I think the exchange is a natural evolvement. It's like in any market, like it was mentioned before, you start from the OTC market, or where a project is being created, verified, and then they have to sell those carbon credits. If you want to get a better price, given those uncertainties on possible methodology of possible double counting, other issues having to do with the type of, whether it's nature-based or it's a technology-based project. It's better to have a central market because you get more transparency, you get the hard data. The companies that produce those projects, they can basically stand out and show that the methodology based on the data creates actual results, and not, let's say, 2 or 3 years down the line, there is, let's say, some deficit of emissions. And basically, it's something that standardizes and harmonizes the whole process. So
why would it be relevant for Greece? And what does it mean for policymakers? Give me a second.
Yeah.
Okay, for Greece, I think, given the fact that there is a compliance market, and the compliance market has some limitations on the sectors that it will hit, there are sectors like, apart from energy, industry, and transportation and shipping, there are sectors like the tourist industry, which is something that, because citizens want to be to go to CO2 neutral strategies, they push for companies to do things.
Let me be more blunt. I mean, the Greek tourism product will stick out even more if it actually manages to become greener in that particular fashion on projects that do take place in Greece, and they're basically financed by those markets.
Yeah, I think you're saying about alignment. You know, that aligning local carbon market projects with local demand and consumption actually plays to the integrity. And I think it plays to the fundamental reason of why we need carbon markets and voluntary carbon markets, which is carbon removals. We are right now on a path where we're trying to, through emission reductions, to get to net zero. In our opinion, we are not on track. In the opinion, actually, of many that measure, we are wildly off track. By 2030, we are going to be, by IEA net zero pathway, around 9 gigatons of emissions off track from a net zero pathway. This is, and the context here, the scalar is that we are at 40 gigatons of emissions, or thereabouts today. To be 9 gigatons off track by 2030 means that you're not doing enough on emissions. You need to do more on removals.
Okay.
And for us, that is the fundamental pillar of why you need to accept that voluntary carbon markets will be around.
And what do you think the European policymakers said? Because typically, I mean, up until recently, they were not really interested, or it appeared that they were not interested.
I would say that...
is that what changed their mind?
I would say that European policymakers have always been interested, but there was a bad experience. The EU ETS is around since 2005. And we did
That's the compliance market. He's taking a mark off for the acronym. Okay.
Point off. Thank you. And we did have voluntary carbon markets. The Kyoto protocol projects were acceptable within the system. There are many compliance schemes that have both a allowance plus a VCM component.
Okay.
A typical measure of allowing VCM into a compliance scheme is around 5%, which is what the EU used to have. But for integrity issues, it took it out.
So
I
if you
would
had
say
to
that coming
explain,
back,
if you had 100 units where you could pollute, you could have 5% of them that you could buy or create by using voluntary carbon credits.
correct.
Okay.
Correct.
And that doesn't. That
And I would say that there are the efforts to increase the integrity, to create frameworks that are more robust, is what is making EU policymakers, and here there has been a trilogue agreement over the last couple of months on, here comes another, I don't want points deducted.
No, that's fine.
Carbon removal certification framework.
Okay.
So the CRCF is, I think, an important piece of legislation for emission trading markets and an important standard setter that will be fleshed out by 2026 and will be implemented and perhaps allow for voluntary carbon markets to come into the EU ETS by 2030 at the earliest.
Let me try to make interpretation here. So
Yeah.
what that would imply for Europe is to say, okay, we had trouble with carbon credits in general. We don't quite trust them, but we know that we need them. So here it is. That's what we mean when we say carbon credits. Go there. Go specifically there.
Absolutely.
Don't come up with new acronyms. Just go for carbon removal. And this is kind of the methodology. From what I understand, it's not ready. They agreed to start looking at it, and by 2026 they're going to come up with it.
Yeah,
You are exactly right. And I would say that carbon removals are where they are pointing more explicitly.
Okay.
And of course, technological are the ones that are the favored ones if you read between the lines and you look at the assessments that were produced ahead of the trilogue. I would say that there is the element, and here we go to something that we can dive on around incentives with carbon farming and the less permanent removals, but that could be excellent incentives in terms of transitioning agriculture and land use
All right.
to a better place.
I don't want you to reveal anything so that you can have clients here actually asking more about that. Also, I want to make sure that I have time to give back to the producer. Tony, very briefly, from what we've seen in terms of voluntary carbon markets around the world, what's the experience? What works best? What hasn't worked that well? Or what are the trends? I mean, how are people correcting for what they've seen?
So I could give you two specific examples that ACX is in. So the one is Indonesia. So both are joint ventures with local exchanges.
Okay.
ATHEX, in Indonesia it's IPX, in Brazil it's B3. Indonesia chose to do a very narrow scope, and what they said is these are national credits only. So anything that happens there can only trade there with Indonesian companies.
And what was the motivation for that? Because that's important.
The motivation is that we're funding, we need to see where things are going, and we need to see where we stand as a country with the Paris Accord. We're 6.2, 6.4, they just need to find out what exactly is going on. Brazil, on the other hand, is an international market. Anybody can go and buy Brazilian credits, the projects, and there is a joint venture there with B3 and ACX. What's very interesting is Indonesia is starting to have second thoughts.
Okay.
And Indonesia is starting to say, you know what, maybe it'd be a good idea to have our credits trade on an international book so that somebody in Greece or a company in Greece can say, you know what, I think these have high integrity, these projects in Indonesia, and I'm going to buy them. They haven't done that yet. I would say that from my perspective, free markets are the best markets.
Okay. Nico, very quickly, Nikos Makris. Should Greek corporates buy Brazilian carbon credits? Or help the emerging markets out there, buy some African credits?
Yeah, and look, I think
and be done with it. Why are we even talking about the rest here?
I think that there, in the European and Greek context, we have EU legislation that is increasingly prescribing and pointing you to what you can do and what you can't do. I would say the recently voted Green Claims Directive is a very important piece of legislation that in a way disincentivizes you or makes you extra careful to look at credits from outside of the EU. The problem that you have is that you don't have, removal credits in enough size within the EU, but that's another problem.
Place of glory for the Greek government, maybe.
But, a couple of things on this. One is that here it is all about greenwashing and dealing with it, and what regulators and policymakers are trying to do is give consumers enough information, because consumers do want products that are green, that are sustainable, and they will preference those products with better prices, with more loyalty. I think that is maybe not uncontestable, but it's quite a strong revealed preference. And what regulators are trying to do is protect the consumer and allow for us to have confidence when we make, at the individual level, those choices.
So I'm just not going to be able to claim that my new iPhone is totally green, right?
Exactly.
All right. So on that happy thought, I really want to get my bonus here for 1 minute and 30 seconds, a small bonus. I want to thank you all. Hopefully I'll keep you just a little bit intrigued enough to chase those three folks and ask them questions. And hopefully hopefully next year, I would say, we have maybe something more apt to say about Hellenic carbon credits. Might be a bit ambitious, but why not? Let's think big. Thank you very much, all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.